The United States government had placed a $10,000 reward on public enemy number 1, John Dillinger. But Dillinger continued to elude local, state, and federal police at every turn, and the public kept cheering him on. Johnny had undergone plastic surgery to change the most notable features of his face, but his mug was still very recognizable. J. Edgar Hoover of the Bureau of Investigation hoped the high reward would turn all the regular law-abiding folk devastated by the Great Depression into a salivating pack of dogs to hunt down Johnny and bring him in. The not-so-law-abiding folk planned to do the same. One person in particular had such plans. Not so much for the reward money, a nice bonus, but in the hopes of gaining a governor's pardon. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thanks for tuning in to the 12th and final episode of the story of John Dillinger, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. On July 4th, 1934, John Dillinger moved in with his new girlfriend, Polly Hamilton, who just 3 days earlier had moved in with East Chicago Madam Anna Sage and her 24-year-old son, Steve. Johnny stashed his arsenal and bulletproof vests in a locked closet, as one does. For the first time since leaving the Indiana State Penitentiary, Dillinger was living like an ordinary citizen. He stayed close to Chicago, but was sighted around the country often. He fell off the grid so completely that many of his underworld contacts even thought he was dead. His new housemates thought Jimmy Lawrence, as they knew him, was easygoing, considerate, and likable. He didn't swear, was a good dancer, and didn't drink much alcohol, mostly sipping orange juice, a gangster's favorite. Johnny, Polly, Anna, and Steve often got takeout, steak or pork chop sandwiches. Sometimes they dined out at Stephen's, always near closing time to ensure privacy. Once, as Stephen was counting the day's take, Johnny tested him. "That's a big wad of money, Steve. Aren't you afraid John Dillinger might drop in and take it away from you?" "No, he just robs from the crooked banks. If Dillinger knew I needed money, he'd probably give it to me." Dillinger grinned. Yeah, he probably would. At home, Polly cooked comfort food meals with biscuits, gravy, tomatoes, green onions, and radishes. In the deli below the apartment, Dillinger bought ice cream, fresh strawberries, and his favorite, frog's legs. After the meals, Johnny rolled up his sleeves and did the dishes, often while singing popular tunes. John laid low, but he took Polly out to dine and dance, to the movies, baseball games, and amusement parks. Thrill-seeker Dillinger was a roller coaster junkie, taking a ride multiple times, alternating screaming with kissing Polly. Polly said Jimmy was very loving in private, a cuddler, but didn't like displaying his affections in public. He also got uncomfortable when others were affectionate around him. He would fine any couple that hugged or kissed during card games 5 cents. It all seemed rather idyllic. But John was unaware that mom like Anna Sage, born Ana Kumpanas in Romania, was in a bit of a pickle. After Anna had moved to the United States in 1909, she worked as a lady of the night and eventually ran a disorderly brothel. Its saloon in the basement was nicknamed the Bucket of Blood because of all the stabbings. The twice-married, twice-divorced Madam Sage stayed in business by giving professional favors to members of the local police departments. Her affair with Sergeant Martin Zarkovich of the East Chicago Police Force cost him his marriage. Despite her law enforcement connections, her houses were frequently raided, and Anna was fined several times. Then Indiana Governor Harry Leslie pardoned her twice, but current Governor Paul McNutt refused to grant her a third pardon. He started the deportation procedure to Romania for the alien of low moral character. The Bureau of Investigation special agent in charge in Chicago, Melvin Purvis, was sure that the recently announced $10,000 reward on Dillinger's head, added to the 5-state PAC reward of $5,000, made the gangster a walking lottery ticket. Someone would cash it in, sooner or later. The first one looking for money was Frank Walsh, an associate of John Dillinger's lawyer, Louis Pickett. He told Inspector Sam Cowley at the Bankers Building in Chicago that he'd overheard Pickett planning a meeting with a guy, probably the guy they were looking for. On July 9th, the federal agents set up a stakeout. But the guy Pickett was meeting was Dr. Ralph Robaines, aka Dr. Wilhelm Lozer, John Dillinger's face rearranger. They arrested the doc, but since there was no reward for Lozer, Walsh was out of luck. Incarcerated Patricia Charrington, late John Hamilton's girl, tried to strike a deal with the feds. She'd deliver them John Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, and George Babyface Nelson in exchange for a full presidential pardon for her husband incarcerated in Leavenworth, plus a reduced sentence for her harboring conviction. But the feds wouldn't play ball. Her demands were too high. They had Bessie Green, the well-connected widow of Eddie Green, also in prison. She said Hamilton was 6 feet under, give or take, and Jean Delaney, late Tommy Carroll's girl, had told her that Dillinger had undergone plastic surgery. Melvin Purvis hoped Dillinger's new face would make him cocky and slip up. Meanwhile, the director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, opened his man purse and deployed all the manpower to rip whatever was left of the new Dillinger gang to shreds. He stepped up his Operation Make Family Suffer and had the G-men harass anyone and everyone who'd ever been in contact with Dillinger, making some wish they'd never met the man. On July 16, 1934, State Troopers Filbert Cross and Fred McAllister were on their routine patrol. When they checked Old Wolf Road, a teenage lover's lane, they saw 3 brand new Ford V8s. Them's not teenage cars. They drove up to take a closer look. A woman sat in the first car by herself. Her husband stood behind the car talking with 3 men. McAllister rolled down the window and asked, "What's the trouble here?" One of the men yelled, "No trouble at all." Seconds later, the officer's windshield exploded in a hail of bullets. Cross was hit and slumped in his seat. McAllister took a slug to the shoulder, got out of the car, rolled into a ditch and emptied his service revolver at the 3 cars that sped away. McAllister rushed his partner to the hospital and notified headquarters, but the men were long gone. The woman in the car had been Helen Gillis, and her hubby, Babyface Nelson, was discussing train robbery plans with John Paul Chase, Jack Perkins, and John Dillinger. Trooper Cross lived. John Dillinger, a victim of his own success, felt the world closing in on him. As the biggest catch in the crime pond, he had the feds nothing to offer in exchange for a deal. They wanted him more than all his underlings combined. He could only trust his fellow wanted gang members, his lawyer Lewis Pickett, his investigator Art O'Leary, and Polly Hamilton and Anna Sage. Johnny had $10,000 for his escape plan to Mexico, which would only cover his transportation, but he made tentative plans with his ride, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph G., to leave the following Monday morning, July 23rd. On July 17th, James Probasco warned Lewis Pickett's investigator Art O'Leary that Dillinger's lawyer was considering making a deal with the G-men and turning everyone, including Art, in. O'Leary was stunned. Why would the lawyer risk invoking the wrath of Nelson and Van Meter by ratting out Dillinger? That evening, O'Leary met with a furious Dillinger, who had also heard his lawyer was about to turn him in. He was on it. Johnny told the detective to take his wife and kids and get out of Dodge. He handed him $500 to help fund his escape. O'Leary promptly took his family to northern Wisconsin to go fishing. On July 21st, Pickett got a call from Dillinger telling him he was considering surrendering and wanted to discuss it with him Monday, July 23rd. Pickett never considered turning in Dillinger. Probasco was seeking revenge on the lawyer because his stupid behavior on July 4th had cost him his meal ticket tenants. But did Johnny know that? A week after John Dillinger moved in, Anna Sage received final notice from the U.S. Immigration Service that her appeals to remain in the country were denied. A warrant was issued for her deportation. She was desperate to find a way to stay. Perhaps if she handed Johnny over to the law, she could stop her deportation to Romania. And a bit of extra cash wouldn't hurt either. On July 19th, Johnny left town for a few days, possibly casing the train robbery location. Sage invited her boyfriend Martin Zarkovich to her apartment to discuss Dillinger. Zarkovich also saw in Johnny a ticket out of his mess. He was currently under investigation for corruption charges, but he needed Dillinger dead. A living Dillinger might link Zark to the Lake County underworld, the Crown Point escape, the hit on his rival detectives Martin O'Brien and Lloyd Mulvihill, various payoffs, and possibly even the long-rumored banker-approved setup of the robbery of the First National Bank of East Chicago, the one that cost Sergeant William O'Malley his life. Zarkovich met with Captain Tim O'Neill, the chief of detectives who'd been assigned to the Dillinger case after Officer O'Malley's murder. But Captain O'Neill had no jurisdiction in Chicago, and on July 20th, he set up a meeting with Captain John Steege and Sergeant Frank Reynolds of the Chicago Dillinger Squad and Lieutenant John Howe of the Scotland Yard Squad. "We will deliver John Dillinger to you right here in your own city, and we can divvy up the rewards. All you have to do is make sure that he isn't taken alive." Steege was about to blow a gasket, but took a moment to control himself, and said that he would give anyone, even John Dillinger, a chance to surrender. Those rotten-to-the-core East Chicago men had better leave his office, or he'd have them thrown out. Steege was still counting on stool pigeon Art McGinnis to lead him to Dillinger and crew. McGinnis had been arrested on Wednesday, but he'd made a miraculous escape from an unlocked cell at the Marquette precinct. Many suspected Steege of arranging the breakout so Chicago PD could catch Dillinger before the federal men could. Zarkovich and O'Neill decided on Plan B. Tell the feds. East Chicago Police Captain Tim O'Neill called Special Agent in charge in Chicago Melvin Purvis with real information about Dillinger. Could they meet somewhere secret? On July 21, 1934, as John Dillinger returned to the apartment, the East Chicago policeman met with Purvis at his home. They had an insider who could put the finger on Dillinger. This snitch insisted on talking privately with the special agent in charge of the Chicago field office before revealing any details. Director Hoover approved the meeting. At about 9 p.m., Purvis and Zarkovich, with Sam Cowley and O'Neill following in another car, parked at the requested meeting place, a dark street across from Children's Memorial Hospital. A half hour later, a woman turned the corner. Purvis said, "She walked past our car and down the street, seeming to survey the situation to determine that there was no trap set for her. She returned, and on a signal got into the car." The two cars drove to an even more secluded spot, Lincoln Park, on Lake Michigan's banks. Anna Sage said a guy named Jimmy Lawrence, a Board of Trade employee, occasionally visited her co-tenant Polly Hamilton at her apartment. When she figured out he was John Dillinger, he confirmed it. She never said the man lived at her place, or else the G-men would have swooped in, taken Dillinger, slapped her with a fugitive harboring charge, and deported her even faster. Anna made two demands in exchange for delivering Dillinger. First, she wanted part of Dillinger's reward money. Purvis said he couldn't make a definite promise about the amount, but he guaranteed it would be substantial. Second, Sage wanted the Bureau to stop her deportation. Purvis was sympathetic but said it was not his department. However, he'd do everything in his power to help her. Sage heard something different. A promise he would handle it. The deal was weak tea, but backseat negotiations were no match for lawyer-assisted negotiations in a bureau office. Anna Sage revealed her plan. The following evening, Dillinger planned to take his girl Polly Hamilton to the movies at his favorite movie theater, the Marlboro. He'd probably invite her along. They could grab him as he left the theater. Sage would wear an orange skirt so all the agents could identify her and, by extension, Dillinger. She would call Purvis the next day to confirm the movie plans. After the secret meeting ended, Purvis first checked if any Jimmy Lawrence worked at the Board of Trade, and when he found none, Cowley called Hoover in Washington, who approved the plan. He wanted the outlaw alive if at all possible, and ordered that all agents carried pistols and not draw unless absolutely necessary. The Bureau and Hoover wouldn't survive another collateral damage backlash. Cowley and his assistant, Special Agent Virgil Peterson, headed for the Marlboro Theater and discreetly made sketches of the layout and noted all the exits. This planning was what Purvis wished he'd had time for at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin. Sunday, July 22, 1934, was the third day of a deadly heat wave in the not-so-windy but miserably humid instead city of Chicago. By 11:30 a.m., the temperature was 101.3 degrees, 38.5 Celsius for the rest of the world. 17 people had died the day before, and 23 would die that day. 100,000 people headed for Lake Michigan hoping for a breeze. John Dillinger wasn't one of them. He stayed hidden in the apartment and spent most of the morning with his butt parked in front of a metal fan. On the 19th floor of the Bankers Building, Sam Cowley, Melvin Purvis, and 17 fully suited-up G-men were holed up in the sweltering office going over every detail of Dillinger's pending capture. They didn't alert the Chicago police. They didn't even tell Captain John Steege's Dillinger Squad, nor John Howe's Scotland Yard Squad. Hoover's men trusted no one. That afternoon, Polly Hamilton finished the breakfast and lunch shift at the S&S sandwich shop and returned to the apartment. She wasn't feeling well. Nurse Johnny put her to bed, aimed a large electric fan her way, and bought some ice cream from the deli downstairs. At 5:15 p.m., Anna Sage told them that she was making fried chicken for dinner and needed to go out and get butter. At the deli downstairs, she dropped a nickel in the phone to call Purvis and whispered, "He's here. He's just come. We'll be leaving in a short while. I still don't know if we're going to the Biograph or Marlboro. I'll call when I know something definite." Wait, what? The Biograph? The men had a detailed plan for Dillinger's capture at the Marlboro across town. They had zero on the Biograph, just a short walk from Sage's apartment. Purvis quickly sent agents Earl Richmond and Jim Metcalf to scope out the place. When they returned with a diagram sketch, it was a nightmare. Several exits in the rear led into 4 separate alleys behind the theater. They now had to cover 2 theaters. At 7 p.m., Sage called again. If they went to the Biograph Theater, she wouldn't wear a hat. If she went across town to the Marlboro, she would. At 7:15 p.m., Melvin Purvis gathered his men and the cops. "Everyone, these are the 5 East Chicago cops. East Chicago cops, everyone." Sergeant Zargovich briefed the team on Dillinger's new appearance. A fuller face, missing mole from his eyebrow, black hair, and pencil-thin mustache. He'd likely wear a gray checkered suit, white shoes, and a straw bowler hat. He'd be with 2 women. One was older and larger, dressed in a white blouse over a bright orange skirt. The second woman, Dillinger's lover, was smaller, with dark hair and a brown complexion. Purvis, betting that Dillinger would want to see Manhattan melodrama with Clark Gable, a gangster movie, would stake out the Biograph with Agent Ralph Brown. Zarkovich, convinced that the girls would persuade Dillinger to go for Little Miss Marker with child star Shirley Temple, would watch the Marlboro with special agent and expert marksman Charles Winstead, with Agent Val Zimmer loitering in the lobby. Everyone else would wait at the Bankers Building for the call telling them which theater Dillinger picked. Purvis rarely gave speeches to his agents, but tonight was different. He spoke in his soft voice. "Gentlemen, you all know the character of John Dillinger. If he appears at either of the picture shows and we locate him and he effects his escape, it will be a disgrace to our bureau. It is the desire that he be taken alive if possible and without injury to any agent of the bureau. Yet, gentlemen, this is the opportunity we've all been awaiting, and he must be taken. Do not unnecessarily endanger your own lives, and if Dillinger offers any resistance, each man will be for himself, and it will be up to each of you to do whatever you think necessary to protect yourself in taking Dillinger." The East Chicago crew grinned. Purvis had just given them the okay to blow John Dillinger away and save their reputations. After John Dillinger finished doing the dishes, he played pinochle with the recovered Polly Hamilton and Anna Sage. At 7:30, everyone got up to change. Anna put on a white blouse and orange skirt. Polly chose a tan skirt, white blouse, tan hose, and white open sandals. Dandy Dillinger wore a white Kenilworth broadcloth shirt, red fleck necktie, and white buckskin shoes. It was too hot to wear a jacket and shoulder holster, and his pocket space was limited. Could he carry his Colt .38? He put tightly rolled-up money in various pockets. The wanted man never left the house without a few $1,000s on him. Today, he carried $3,300, 65 of which were in his wallet. Dillinger wouldn't tell the girls which movie they were going to see until they left the apartment. So, Little Miss Marker, a Shirley Temple flick, or Manhattan melodrama, a gangster movie with Clark Gable? Which one do you think Johnny picked? July 22nd, 7:37 p.m. Melvin Purvis and Ralph Brown parked their car just left of the air-conditioned Biograph Theater entrance. Melvin checked with the box office lady that the next showing of Manhattan Melodrama would start at 8:30. Brown and Purvis tried to sit still as they watched people gradually file in. To have craned our necks as to observe in all directions would have aroused suspicion and might have frightened Dillinger. But the two agents did everything to make themselves obvious. Every 5 minutes, Brown, his pockets jangling with nickels, jumped from the car and ran to a nearby payphone to call Sam Cowley at the field office to check if Dillinger had appeared at the Marlboro. Back at the Bankers Building, 45 minutes of not yet made the waiting G-men increasingly antsy. By now, the entrances to both movie theaters got more and more crowded, and Dillinger could easily sneak in unnoticed. Around 8:30, Dillinger, the hatless Sage, and Polly, also hatless that evening, strolled to the Biograph. At 8:38 p.m., Purvis saw the face of a man he'd studied so intently. Dyed black hair, glasses, a Music Man straw boater hat pulled low, gray trousers, not a checkered suit, and no coat. There was Anna Sage in her orange skirt, and Polly Hamilton, who fit the description. John Dillinger. Purvis considered getting him right then and there. It might have been a simple thing for the two of us to take him, but we would have been taking the chance of endangering the lives of several innocent bystanders. We knew his previous record, his utter ruthlessness, and his entire disregard for human life. We let him go into the theater. Dillinger didn't notice the agents in the car, and while the ladies waited out front, Johnny, cool, casual, in no hurry, paid 90 cents for 3 tickets to the box office lady. Under the marquee lights, the older woman's orange skirt looked blood red. The trio went inside. Purvis and Brown were out of the car the next instant. Brown ran to the phone booth to tell HQ that Dillinger was at the Biograph. Purvis hustled to the box office, bought a ticket, and followed Dillinger inside to see where he sat. If there were empty seats behind him, 3 agents could take those seats. He said one could pinion Dillinger's left arm, one his right, and the other his head. But Dillinger had arrived late, and the lights were already down. The ice-cooled auditorium was packed. Dillinger and Polly found 2 empty seats up front, 3 rows from the screen. Anna had to sit by herself in the back. Purvis couldn't see a thing. He left and asked the ticket lady what the movie's runtime was. 1 hour and 34 minutes, plus a half hour of previews and features and a post-show. That's a long wait. At the Bankers Building, Cowley called Hoover with the latest developments. Hoover sanctioned the plan in place. "You've done well so far. Give the men instructions to take Dillinger alive, but instruct them also to protect themselves, to take no chances. The life of one government agent is worth 1,000,000 Dillingers." John Dillinger really enjoyed the movie, laughing and sneaking kisses with his girl Polly. In one scene, a secretary warned the prosecutor against inviting an old friend and crook to his wedding. She said,
"Remember what happened to that district attorney in Chicago? Just for having his picture taken with some gangsters at dinner."
The real-life gangster was thrilled to see his encounter with prosecutor Robert Estelle at Crown Point referenced in a movie. Outside, Special Agent Melvin Purvis was losing his cool. It had been 20 minutes since Agent Brown had alerted HQ, and none of the support troops had arrived. Paranoid Purvis again went to the ticket lady to ask about showtimes. She now suspected the nervous little man was plotting a holdup. At last, the agents began trickling in. Everyone parked their cars blocks away and continued on foot. Cowley and Purvis placed their chess pieces, 19 federal agents and 5 East Chicago cops, on the virtual chessboard around the theater. Purvis, the only agent beside Cowley who knew what Anna Sage looked like, stood in a doorway 10 steps left of the ticket booth. The moment Dillinger came through the door, he'd signaled everyone by lighting a cigar. Agent Ed Hollis stood 10 feet away from him across the sidewalk. He was chatting with Ralph Brown at the wheel of the parked federal car, ready to give chase. G-Men Joe McCarthy and Bob Gillespie and East Chicago Sergeants Peter Sopsick and Glenn Stretch stood a few yards further up the street on the right of the Biograph exit, just in case Dillinger turned that way after leaving the theater. Across the street, Val Zimmer and Sergeant Zarkovich sat in a parked car. Jim Metcalf stood in a doorway behind them. He had a clear view of the box office. Charles Jerry Campbell and Earl Richmond were further up the street. Further down, Captain Tim O'Neill stood by a garage, while East Chicago Sergeant Walter Conroy patrolled the alley next to it. G-men John McLaughlin, Bill Ryan, and Dan Sullivan roamed the alley behind the theater to watch the rear exits and the alley next to the Biograph. Agents Ray Saran, Tom Connor, and Mike Glynn covered the other back alley, which was a shortcut to the Sage apartment. Sharpshooter Clarence Hurt waited in a dark doorway 30 feet down from Purvis's location. When fellow sharpshooter Charles Winstead arrived from the Marlboro a little later, he ducked in a doorway next to him, closer to the theater. Now the best shooters in the bunch blocked the direction Dillinger would most likely go. John Wells and Alan Lockerman stood on the curb across from them. Inspector Cowley moved around. I was in a roving position and kept in touch with all agents in order to see that all points were being covered properly. He would act if Dillinger somehow escaped the converging forces. No one would act until Purvis gave 2 signals. He'd light a cigar to signal Dillinger was seen, and he'd wave his hand as a cue for everyone to close in. One last procedural thing: getting the final orders from Hoover. Some claim Hoover gave a shoot-to-kill order, but there's no evidence of that. The G-men wanted Dillinger alive. The Chicago men wanted him dead. With everyone placed on the board, they waited in the murderous heat. Purvis said there was no way of knowing whether Dillinger would stay for the whole show. Some patron in the theater might arouse his suspicions, causing him to leave. Our vigilance could not be relaxed even for a split second. I bit off the end of a cigar and nervously chewed on it. If Johnny stayed till the end, it would be a long wait. Inside the Biograph, Manhattan Melodrama was in its closing reel, and the theater engineer in charge of the air conditioning unit went outside to take temperature readings. He saw men loitering in the alley and a figure standing on the catwalk above the boiler room. A holdup! He raced to the theater manager, Charles Shapiro's office. Shapiro wasn't sure. Thieves lurked near the ticket window, not in the alley. But he brought the engineer to the boiler room, locked the door, and stayed put. Then the cashier beckoned him. A man was sitting on the bakery steps across the street. Some men were hanging around nearby, and a little jumpy man had asked her 3 times when the show would end. "All right, I'll hold up it is." Shapiro shouted to his assistant manager to get the money and the cashier and go into his office. Then he dialed the Sheffield Street police station to send a plainclothes squad. At about 10:20 p.m., a city patrol car drove up the alley and stopped near the 3 men standing at the entrance. One detective jumped out and his partner yelled, "Find out who he is before you shoot him." The detective pointed a riot gun at Agent Ray Saran's chest. "Show me your identification. What are you doing here?" At the same time, 2 Chicago plainclothes cops entered Shapiro's office to get the 411. Then they checked out the loitering agents to the right of the theater. Agent Purvis was stunned. Hoover had told them not to alert Chicago PD nor the Biograph manager, who might tip Dillinger off to avoid a shootout, or because he was a fan. The operation was going south like Sherman. Inside the Biograph Theater, Manhattan Melodrama was nearly over. The prosecutor, Jim Wade, had convicted his outlaw friend Blackie Gallagher of murder. Blackie refused his offer of life imprisonment. He'd rather die. On his way to death row, the movie gangster stopped at the cell of a fellow prisoner. Blackie offered his advice.
Die the way you lived, all of a sudden. That's the way to go. Don't drag it out. Living like that doesn't mean a...
On death row, his childhood friend, prosecutor turned Governor Wade, said,
"I can't help it, Blackie. I'm not going to let you die. I can't do it."
Hey, do you think you're doing me a favor by keeping me locked up in this filthy trap for the rest of my life? You're going to make a great sacrifice, ruin your career, for what? So that I can rot in this hole. Would you do that to me? No, thanks. Hey, look, Jim. If I can't live the way I want, then at least let me die when I want.
As the governor left the prison lights dimmed as the switch was pulled, and an inmate called out,
$30, they're giving it to him!
When the house lights came up, real-life gangster John Dillinger, moved by Blackie's bravado, remained in his seat for a few moments to let it all sink in as the theater cleared out. At 10:30 p.m., the crowd started to leave the Biograph Theater. Showtime. A trembling Melvin Purvis tore a match from a matchbook and scanned the crowd for the outlaw. I knew that we could not let him escape this time. We would never have another opportunity like this. Meanwhile, Agent Saran convinced the Chicago detectives that he was a federal agent on assignment. The police car backed up and then disappeared. Inside, Anna saw Jimmy and Polly come up the aisle and joined them. Before leaving, Dillinger adjusted his glasses and put on his straw hat. They were caught up in a crowd in the lobby. Polly grabbed Dillinger's left arm. Anna was on Johnny's right side, slightly behind. 10:35 p.m. Purvis saw John Dillinger flanked by the two women come through the doors. To the gangster's right, one of the agents showed his credentials to the Chicago cops. The trio turned left, didn't notice the fuzz, and walked toward Purvis. Purvis recalled, "I watched him as he moved slowly forward. He looked into my eyes. Surely he must have seen something more than a casual interest in them, but apparently he didn't recognize me." Purvis struck the match and lit what remained of the chewed-up cigar, signaling the others that their target had left the building. It appeared no one saw the signal. The East Chicago assassins, Stretch and Sopsik, were talking to the Chicago cops, and the crowd blocked the others' view of Purvis. Dillinger kept walking past Purvis south, closing in on the back alley. Purvis struck another match. No one noticed. A few more steps. Purvis noticed Gillespie and McCarthy approaching fast. They'd seen the flame. Zarkovich, ready to end Dillinger to save himself, noticed the agents as well and sprinted across the street toward his buddies. Agents Richmond and Campbell finished flashing their credentials to the Chicago cops when Campbell saw Purvis and the lit cigar. He and Richmond joined marksman Clarence Hurt. Hurt had seen the match ignite, got into hitman mode, and watched everyone who passed him. What happened next is somewhat confusing, because of course it is. Purvis never mentioned calling out Dillinger until years later when he claimed he'd said, "Stick 'em up, Johnny." Some said that someone called out, "Hello, John," or "John." Others declare that nothing was said at all. Purvis fell in a few steps behind Johnny, but there were too many people around still, so he waited, giving the second signal. The gangster and the ladies passed Agent Ralph Brown's car. Agent Ed Hollis watched him all casual-like, then joined Purvis. Both drew guns and closed in on Dillinger. The crowd thinned. This was it. Purvis waved his arm. Nothing. He waved again. Now agents closed in. If Johnny fled in any direction, he'd run into an agent. Dillinger passed Hurt, who saw Anna's bright orange skirt. He whispered to fellow marksman Winstead, "That's Dillinger with straw hat and glasses." Johnny reached the alley. He was mere feet from Winstead. Hurt casually crossed in front of the trio. Winstead joined Purvis and Hollis trailing Dillinger, and aimed his gun. He remembered. Polly knew something was up. She grabbed Dillinger by the shirt. Anna moved up and held Dillinger's arm as well. Johnny hadn't noticed anything, but suddenly he realized something was very wrong. Dillinger untangled himself from the women, crouched and ran, reaching for the .38 in his right pocket. Johnny checked his peripheral vision, but bumped into a woman and started to spin around. Agents Lockerman and Wells stood with guns drawn. Hollis, Winstead, and Hurt opened fire. One gunshot, then another, then more, 6 in all. The shots came so close together that many agents and witnesses said they only heard a single bang. 4 bullets struck Dillinger. 3 did little damage, but the 4th was devastating. It went through the base of his neck, fractured his second cervical vertebra, sliced through his spinal cord and the right side of his brain, then exited through the lower lid of his right eye. Dillinger spun around, caught himself, took a few steps forward, and collapsed at the entrance of the alley on his elbow and face. The glasses shattered, and the brim of his straw hat snapped off. The Colt .38, safety on, in his hand. The crowd started running in all directions, their screams bouncing off the walls. Charles Winstead stood by Dillinger, his revolver aimed at his head. He mumbled some words that I couldn't understand. That was the end. Anna and Polly had abandoned Johnny the moment the shooting began. They'd hiked up their skirts, ran through the alley, and returned to their apartment. Polly's reaction obviously meant she knew that Jimmy wasn't a mere Board of Trade clerk. Chaos ensued. Cars and trolleys all stopped and passengers got out. Cops and agents who had hit the deck to avoid getting caught in the crossfire jumped up and circled the body to keep the crowds at bay. No cops or agents were hurt. but 2 women were. Etta Natalski, the woman that Dillinger had bumped into, had been shot in her thigh. Teresa Paulus, who had walked behind Dillinger, was hit in the knee and hip. She screamed, ran across the alley with her dress pulled up, and collapsed. Both women recovered, and their medical bills were paid for by the Bureau. But reckless G-men strike again. Agent Winstead lingered by the outlaw's body and saw an unidentified Chicago cop search Dillinger, which, according to Agent Greer Waltz, was still kicking and moving around on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, Agent Tom Connor pulled his car into the alley so his headlights illuminated the eerie scene. Cowley picked up the shattered silver-rimmed glasses, the crushed straw boater hat, and an unwrapped La Corona cigar that was in John Jr.'s pocket and filed them for evidence. Then he and Purvis went to the theater manager's office and identified themselves. Shapiro was furious. Why hadn't the G-man alerted him? He could have helped. Cowley used Shapiro's phone to call Hoover in Washington. John Dillinger was dead. The director restrained his jubilation and simply said, "Fine work, Sam." 20 minutes later, a police van known as Black Maria parked at the alley's entrance. Agent Waltz and others lifted Dillinger's body onto a stretcher and slid it into the van. Then 5 agents climbed aboard. John Dillinger died while on the way to Chicago's Alexian Brothers Hospital. He was 31 years old. A large crowd had already gathered at the hospital, and the cops figured they'd save time by having a doctor come outside and declare the outlaw deceased in the van. At 10:55 p.m., Dr. Walter Prezeg appeared, put his stethoscope to Dillinger's chest, searched for a pulse, and announced, "This man is dead." Since John was already dead, he was refused admittance at the hospital. A Chicago homicide detective ordered the body to be taken to the Cobb County morgue on Polk Street. All night, radio broadcasted the news of John Dillinger's demise, and soon after, the newspaper's extra editions hit the streets. Thousands of people swarmed the small red puddle in the alley. Some say that people dipped newspapers, handkerchiefs, and hems of women's skirts in the blood. Meanwhile, another curious mob formed at the Cook County morgue. Charles Parker, a young doctor, waited with a cart in the first-floor receiving room. Agents thought he was a coroner. He wasn't. He was a doctor and a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. When the paper called him that Dillinger was dead, he raced to the morgue to help out and get a hell of a scoop at the same time. Dillinger was the 116th body to be admitted to the morgue that July, but Parker worried about the crowds, called morbids by morgue personnel, and gave the outlaw a fast pass to the basement examining room. Sergeant Frank Reynolds of the Dillinger Squad arrived. Happy as a clam to see his nemesis dead, he shook the outlaw's cold hand. Agent Maxwell Chaffetz managed to push through the crowd and check the gangster's scarred fingerprints. He told no one anything, only called Sam Cowley and whispered, "It's Dillinger. There's no question in my mind at all." At last, Deputy Coroner Jack Butler arrived and seized control of the circus. He and Parker stripped and examined the body. The powder burns of the fatal wound at the base of Dillinger's skull indicated the muzzle of the gun had only been inches away. Charles Winstead was declared the shooter. Agent Dan Sullivan meticulously recorded Dillinger's possessions. The official record said Dillinger was carrying $7.70 in his pocket, so someone had robbed the robber of nearly $3,300. The news of John Dillinger's death reached Mooresville, Indiana, late that Sunday night. Everett and Margaret Moore, publishers of the Mooresville Times, drove to the Dillinger farm to break the news to John Dillinger Sr., who was in bed because he wasn't feeling well. The elder Dillinger, barefoot, wearing a shirt and overalls, sagged against the door. "You sure it's true this time? You know they've said that before." As Mooresville residents converged on the farm, Sr. sank into the large chair in his living room. Well, John is dead. At last it has happened. The thing I have prayed and prayed would not happen. I just hoped he'd give himself up, but that wouldn't have been John, I guess. It's hard to believe. He wept. Because of the heat, Johnny's sister Audrey Hancock and her family were sleeping on the lawn of her home in Maywood, Indiana. 2 G-men arrived to tell them what had happened. Audrey cried and then said, "He was just like a son to me." Audrey, Emmett, and Mary raced to the farm, which was besieged by reporters. Audrey fell into her father's arms and wept. Her cries woke Doris and Francis, 16 and 12, who heard that their big brother was gone. Daddy, did he shoot first? No, I guess not. Maybe they were afraid to try and arrest him. John's half-brother Hubert Dillinger showed up a little later and pushed his way through the ever-growing crowd. Meanwhile, the town's pharmacist opened his store as a town's meeting place. It remained open until dawn. By mid-morning, Audrey snapped at the reporters. Johnny wasn't a bad boy. I reared him and I know. They got him. That's what they wanted to do, and there just isn't anything more to about it. A weary John Sr. was more patient. We've had enough pictures spread over the country. But I guess the boys with a camera have to make their living too. Omer Van Meter's lady, Marie Conforti, told him that John Dillinger was dead. Van and Marie fled to St. Paul. At the Ohio State Prison, Harry Pierpont, Charles Makeley, and Russell Clark took the news hard. A reporter asked for a response, and Pierpont asked, "You got a brother? Then you just write about your own brother, and you'll have the right dope on Johnny Dillinger." Makeley agreed. Yeah, he was the kind of guy anyone would be glad to have for a brother. At the federal detention home in Milan, Michigan, Billy Frechette started to cry, then said, "That's too bad." U.S. Attorney General Homer Cummings was happy, gratifying as well as reassuring. Indiana Governor McNutt responded with one word: delighted. Lewis Pickett, driving home from Platteville, Wisconsin, heard the news of Dillinger's demise over his car radio. He smiled. Yeah, sure. But as he heard more details, he got worried. He drove straight to the Biograph Theater, where an excited crowd was still milling about. Pickett asked a policeman he'd known for years, "Surely not Dillinger?" "It's right, they got him." The lawyer had the officer drive him to the morgue, where he forced his way through the morbids to see Dillinger's body. He muttered, "That's Dillinger, all right." A full autopsy was performed by pathologist Dr. J.J. Kearns and his assistant Dr. David Fisher. Little more about that later. An official inquest on July 23rd, presided over by Coroner Frank J. Walsh, lasted only 35 minutes. The Chicago PD boycotted the inquest. They were hella mad at the feds for shutting them out of the operation. Federal agent Earl Richmond testified that he had identified John Dillinger via his fingerprints. Inspector Sam Cowley gave a brief overview of the shooting. He said the outlaw drew a gun from his pants pocket, but Sergeant Zarkovich said that John was shot before he could draw anything. Melvin Purvis, writing after his resignation from government service, stated, "He whirled, tugged at his pants pocket. I know what happened. His gun was in that pocket, and the hammer caught on the cloth as he tried to pull it out. He ran. We fired." Well, Purvis, the gun recovered on the scene was a hammerless automatic, and gunslinger extraordinaire John Dillinger would never carry one likely to catch his pocket's lining. Besides, Johnny had developed the habit of always sliding his thumb over the top of any gun to avoid this very problem. The coroner's jury quickly delivered a verdict of justifiable homicide. The jury praised the G-men for their efficient participation in the occurrence, as shown by the fact that there was no further loss of life in the capture of a man of this type. That was all. Coroner Walsh, pausing to reflect, stated that he hoped Dillinger's undignified death served as a warning to young men that he wasn't someone to be idolized. After the inquest, Dillinger's body was put on display in the morgue, and some 15,000 people, mostly women, shuffled past John's body, laying on an angled slab for better viewing. One of those was Judge William Murray of Crown Point, Indiana. Morgue staffers, seeing a chance to make an extra buck, sold copies of his toe tags, which were put on John's foot for a few moments. Then the body was transferred to McCready's funeral home, but the circus was far from over. The day after the killing, newspapers ran stories about a woman in red who had betrayed John Dillinger. In Chicago, a street artist scribbled a poem in chalk on a brick alley wall near the Biograph. "Strangers, stop and wish me well. Just say a prayer for my soul in hell. I was a good fellow," most people said, betrayed by a woman all dressed in red. Anna Sage was terrified her identity would be revealed and that Dillinger's living gangmates would come for her. She asked Martin Zarkovich to drive her to the banker's building to ask Purvis for protection. Cowley, not Purvis, took the meeting and said he first had to talk to Hoover, so Anna spent another terrifying night in her apartment. Cowley told Hoover that Sage was most hysterical. She is upset over the fact that the East Chicago people got themselves in the papers, and she believes that this in itself is enough to put her on the spot. While Purvis told everyone not to talk about Anna Sage, Chicago police detectives arrested Anna in her apartment and questioned her for hours. And just like that, reporters knew the name of the mysterious lady in red. Chicago PD used 2 keys found on Dillinger's body to open the closet in her apartment. But Sage had dumped his arsenal he had locked in there in a nearby channel in Lincoln Park the day before. Swimmers discovered the guns the following day, but no one could trace the arsenal back to her house. However, the keys found on Johnny proved that he'd been more than just a casual visitor to the house. Fortunately, Cowley arrived at the police station to save the day and whisked Sage away. He put her and Polly Hamilton up at a nondescript hotel in Detroit, Michigan. Meanwhile, Cowley, Purvis, and Hoover put their heads together to figure out what to do with Sage's 2 demands. They gave her $5,000 for her services and cheated her out of the rest. And when Anna asked Governor McNutt for a pardon, Indiana State Police claimed that she had done nothing to help them catch Dillinger. Anna was deported to Romania in 1936 and passed away there in 1947. By early morning, July 23rd, old man John Dillinger went on his first ever trip to Chicago, Illinois. He and Hubert climbed into the 1923 Blackhurst Cadillac hearse belonging to the local undertaker Friday Harvey. In the back was a dark brown wicker body basket lined with oilcloth. Late that afternoon, the hearse arrived at the McCready Funeral Home in Chicago. When Dillinger Sr. got out of the car, exhausted from the journey, hundreds of people rushed the hearse. Dillinger Sr. gasped, "I want a drink of water. I feel faint." Once ushered into McCready's narrow embalming room, Sr. saw his son for the first time in months. My boy, my boy." There were no tears. Hubert put his arm around his father and led him away through the crowd to get some rest. They had to wait for the coroner to release the body. Several people offered to tell Dad the gruesome details of his son's demise, but Dillinger Sr. waved them off. While he was waiting, his sorrow turned into fury. He told reporters, "They didn't give my boy a chance. They shot him down in cold blood. I wouldn't want to see a dog shot down like that. Why? He had 15 or 20 men trying to kill him. That ain't fair. I'd rather have him shot than captured, though. And John would rather have had it that way." 6 men carried the deceased outlaw in a wicker basket to the hearse, which had to drive through a large crowd gathered at McCready's. Chicago squad cars escorted the hearse along Route 41 toward Mooresville, Indiana. Thousands lined the route. Sr. remembered, men, women, and children lined the streets of Chicago, and throughout the entire trip through Indiana, automobiles filled the roads and crowds assembled to see John Dillinger's last ride. For part of the trip, Dillinger Sr. rode in the back with his dead son. There was much congratulating and backslapping among the agents at the Bankers Building for having successfully removed public enemy number 1 from this earth. Meanwhile, Indiana authorities were focused on the backstabbingness of it all. Although Hoover sent a letter praising O'Neill and Zarkovich with the highest esteem and best regards, Indiana was not amused. Their cops had blatantly sidestepped them, and they immediately demoted Captain Tim O'Neill to sergeant and Sergeant Martin Zarkovich to detective. John's death dominated local, national, and international newspaper headlines for days. Initially, U.S. newspapers hardly questioned the acts of the brave federal men. That's because all the information was fed to them by the federal men. What they didn't know, they made up. They mostly focused on the femme fatales in the gangster's life and concluded that Dillinger's insatiable love for women and movies led to his demise. And since only $7 were found on him, he was obviously broke. Crime doesn't pay, kids. Then, about 3 days later, anomalies came to light. Eyewitnesses came forward to tell a different tale. It was revealed that corrupt East Chicago cops from another state were at the scene. The heroic lady in red was actually a madam who ran a brothel, and John's body parts and autopsy report went missing, as did his gun. What was even happening? Who killed John Dillinger? No one knew, and no one cared to find out. The federal men say Agent Charles Winstead fired the final shot, but the East Chicago police said one of their men killed the outlaw. J. Edgar Hoover later said that his death was an execution and suspected that Martin Zarkovich was there to make sure Dillinger wasn't taken alive. Whoever did it, one thing is clear: John Dillinger was shot from behind, and no attempt was made to capture him alive. The feds lost the narrative once the wave of gripes and difficult questions started rolling in. When Hoover refused to answer any of them, the tsunami of criticism of the federal men shattered the bravery story, and with it came the deluge of admiration for Johnny's carefree life motto, swagger and style. The outlaw's teenage fans wrote raging letters to newspapers, disgusted about Johnny's cold-blooded execution. A Virginia editor wrote, "Any brave man would have walked down the aisle and arrested Dillinger. Why were there so many cowards afraid of this one man?" The answer is that the federal agents are mostly cowards. Some felt the G-men were no different from the lawless government forces in Germany, Russia, and Italy. Even Germany had questions. The Völkische Beobachter published an article with the title, "Barbarism? Is a policeman calling a man by his first name before shooting him down sufficient trial?" A great fella, eh? Calls out, "Hello, John," and simply shoots the surprised gangster down without giving him a chance to say a word. Does a country in which this happens deserve the name of a constitutional state? Which was the nation of barbarians? Germany, which executed criminals according to the rule of law, or the United States, where gangsters are gunned down in the streets without as much as a how do you do? Boy, if you've lost the Nazis. The criticism didn't let up. In 1935, an exasperated Hoover passed FBI intel to Washington newsman Rex Collier to prove that the shooting of Dillinger was justified. However, the debate rages to this day. Meanwhile, Hoover was mighty miffed that Melvin Purvis and not Sam Cowley was considered the man, while he, the mastermind of the operation, was completely ignored. Things got worse when U.S. Attorney General Homer Cummings, touring the country's prison systems, organized a hastily arranged photo-op with Chicago's main G-man, Melvin Purvis. Purvis's fame went through the roof. Hoover fumed that Cowley was once again ignored and made Purvis's life at the office unbearable. The widow of Carter Baum, the special agent who'd been killed by Babyface Nelson during the Little Bohemia raid, showed up in Washington to talk to Hoover. Hoover promptly declared Nelson the new public enemy #1 and told reporters, "We're going to get that fella. Nobody can kill one of our men and get away with it." But a few days later, Nelson, while still a wanted man, was demoted. Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd was now the public's #1 enemy. Just after 3 p.m. on July 24, 1934, thousands of morbids welcomed John Dillinger's body at the E.F. Harvey Funeral Home in Mooresville, Indiana. After the first public showing, 4,000 people were still waiting, drawn not so much by the death of a hero, but by the excitement, the glamour, the grotesqueness, the freak show, a break from ordinary life. When the crowds got unruly, a second public showing was held. Some went in to check the body several times because John Dillinger didn't look like the man they thought they knew. He was too big, too small, too heavy, too thin. Rumors started that the wrong man had been killed and that Johnny had escaped law enforcement one more time. Dillinger's older sister, Audrey Hancock, told Harvey she could positively identify her brother by the scar on his leg. When Harvey uncovered the leg, she said, "There is no question in my mind. Bury him." But conspiracy theorists were like, "Nope, not buying it." More about that later. Johnny's body, dressed in a gray herringbone suit, white shirt, and polka dot tie, was moved to Audrey's small wooden house in Maywood, and the carnival followed him there. Soon the streets were filled with morbids, soda pop stands, and souvenir peddlers. Eventually, the security guards armed with clubs had to be replaced by the Indiana police, who surrounded the home. Yet another public viewing ended when a drunk nearly stumbled into the casket. Ralph Olsman, the Dillinger lookalike who was making a career out of being mistakenly arrested, was among the few Audrey allowed inside. He figured he might be able to play John Dillinger in the movie someday. He never did. News broke that John Hamilton, Homer Van Meter, and Babyface Nelson were all on their way to Maywood to pay last respects to their leader. bystanders recognized them all, including the incarcerated Billy Frechette and Harry Pierpont. But of the gang, only Mary Kinder showed up. She stayed to support the family throughout their ordeal. Little Bohemia Lodge's Emil Wanatka had the audacity to send a fancy wreath. It was placed by the body anyway. John Dillinger's funeral was announced for Thursday, July 26th at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, the forever home of former President Benjamin Harrison, 3 vice presidents, 2 governors, and pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly. Several plot owners protested the motorized Jesse James of the 30s being interred there, but others said the old man had paid for the plot and his son should be allowed to be buried there. The cemetery's custodians agreed, and the state police, the attorney general, and the heads of the state public safety office provided police protection. But the date was a ruse. Early on the morning of Wednesday, July 25, 1934, a day earlier than announced, a motorcade of 20 cars brought John Herbert Dillinger to the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. But people had been staking out the cemetery gates and rumors quickly spread. The funeral was private to prevent curious hordes from overrunning the grave plots. Over 100 policemen were deployed to keep the 5,000 people now converging on the cemetery at bay. Still, some managed to sneak in. Some even brought their lunches. The weather reports predicted a storm, and a tent was placed over the gravesite. Reverend Charles Fillmore, who had baptized young John Dillinger, spoke a few words as final rites. But a sudden thunderclap and rain sent everybody running for their cars. When the rain stopped 10 minutes later, the mourners returned to Lot 94, Section 44. The elder Dillinger stood stoically as Audrey, Doris, and Francis wept. While 4 grave diggers lowered the casket, Reverend Fillmore spoke. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." At 3:15 p.m., John Dillinger was laid to rest next to his mother, as Dad had promised. Soon after, souvenir hunters shredded the funeral wreaths, and even cops got in on the action. Now John Sr. worried that someone might dig up his son's body. He ordered cement mixed with scrap metal to be poured into the hole. The gravestone wasn't placed until 2 years after the funeral to prevent it from being stolen. Yet, the stone was hacked to pieces by the public. It was replaced 4 times. But, as of yet, no one has dug through the cement barrier. It wasn't for lack of trying. Some believe that the individual who was shot and killed by federal agents outside the Biograph Theater was not John Dillinger, but a stand-in he'd hired, and that the G-men lied they'd killed him to cover up another embarrassing blunder and salvage their reputation. The more the family insisted the dead man was their Johnny, the more the rumors grew. According to some, not pathologists, the autopsy file, that went missing for years, showed weird results. Viewers thought his face looked wrong, and the scar on his lip was missing. It's like they've never seen dead men before. John had cosmetic surgery to remove his scar and other markers on his face. Mary Kinder already noticed a few days earlier that Johnny looked like he had the mumps. But his missing incisor was filled in. Well, he might have gotten some dental work done, or filled in the gap as not to stand out in public. Myths like these always surround famous outlaw deaths, but John Dillinger's conspiracies are not widespread and remain unsupported by scientists and law enforcement. John's sister Audrey only needed to see the scar on his leg to recognize him, and Dr. Lozer's fingerprint removal had failed enough to leave enough markers to identify him. But let me ask the naysayers this. Would Johnny, thrill-seeker and mischief-maker #1, have been able to lay low for long and resisted making a fool out of the agents as he had done at every opportunity? Would the bumbling feds fending off the criticism surrounding John's death been able to keep this supposed blunder secret all this time? Would the Chicago Dillinger Squad and Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach have agreed to go along with the story and given up on the chase? Most importantly, would Johnny have been able to stay away from his beloved Billy, for whom he'd risk life and limb if only he could die in her arms, as he once wrote her, when she got out of prison? Let me know what you think in the comments. Some Dillinger family members want closure to this day. In July 2019, Michael C. Thompson, Dillinger's nephew, filed a permit with the Indiana Department of Health to have Dillinger's body exhumed. He wanted to check his DNA. The History Channel planned this whole documentary around it. However, several other family members protested his efforts, and the Crown Hill Cemetery refused permission. Thompson lost a court case trying to supersede the cemetery's decision, and he didn't file an appeal. The History Channel shelved the documentary in September 2019, and remains so as of July 2024. With John Dillinger gone, the gang scattered, but the hunt was still on. On the night of Dillinger's death, Homer Van Meter and his girlfriend Marie Conforti fled to St. Paul, hoping to find shelter with Harry Sawyer at the Green Lantern or his partner Jack Pfeiffer at the Hollyhocks Club. But Sawyer had beat town, and Pfeiffer didn't want federal agents coming down on his place and told Van to scram. In fact, an estimated 75% of underworld folk had fled St. Paul. Exasperated, Van Meter rented a room at a tourist camp outside Walker, Minnesota, and continued looking for a safe house. It is unclear what happened next, but according to a federal informant, Pfeiffer called Tom Brown, a corrupt former police chief who had helped the Barker Karpus gang with the Ham and Bremer kidnappings. Brown, who'd been demoted pending an investigation, figured that bringing in such a high-profile yig could restore his reputation. On August 23, 1934 at 5 p.m., a car dropped off Van Meter at a car dealership in St. Paul for a meeting. When Van left the dealership 15 minutes later, Tom Brown, Police Chief Frank Cullen, and 2 detectives all pointed their shotguns and Thompson submachine guns at him. One of the officers yelled, "Stick 'em up!" Van Meter pulled a .380 Colt automatic from its waistband and started running, firing 2 shots over his shoulder. His straw boater hat fell off. He grabbed it and held it as he ran. The lawmen unleashed all the guns, but when a woman walked into their line of fire, they went in pursuit. Van Meter dashed across the avenue, dodging oncoming cars, ran down a street and hooked it into an alley. A dead end. He stopped and turned. The officers were right there. Brown fired his sawed-off shotgun, blasting Van Meter into the air against a brick wall. Van scrambled up and raised his arm to fire his Colt, but a submachine gun burst nearly severed it. All 4 lawmen unleashed the fracking fury, ripping his body to shreds with 50 bullets. All entry wounds were in the back. Homer Van Meter, who always said he didn't want to die in some filthy alley like Tommy Carroll, died in a filthy alley. He was 28 years old. The 4 officers reported finding $1,323 on Van Meter, but his friends and associates claimed he was carrying at least $10,000 that day. An hour later, J. Edgar Hoover in Washington heard the news and he was furious. Killing gangsters was their thing. Everyone else had to back off. Local police were like, "Turnabout's fair play." Rumors swirled about who tipped off the cops about Van's meeting. Some claimed it was Babyface Nelson, who was fed up with Van Meter. Others claimed a local bank robber, Tommy Gannon, was to blame. Ultimately, everything led back to Sawyer and Pfeiffer, who'd been holding on to Van Meter's money, and were probably looking to keep it. The following day, Homer Van Meter's body returned home to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Only an undertaker and a few reporters awaited its arrival. He was buried without event in Fort Wayne's Lindenwood Cemetery. That same day, parole violator Marie Conforti was arrested and jailed. The federal men felt that Homer Van Meter's death ended the Dillinger gang. As far as Hoover was concerned, what remained of the war on crime was strictly a mopping-up operation. Well, Babyface Nelson and his besties were still out there, plotting all kinds of things. A month after Homer Van Meter's death, and exactly 2 months after John Dillinger's demise, on September 22, 1934, a desperate Harry Pierpont and Charles Makeley hoped to pull off a John Dillinger Crown Point-style escape. They would bluff their way out of the Ohio State Penitentiary using fake guns made from soap, wire, toothpaste tubes, paper clips, jigsaw puzzle pieces, and tinfoil from a cigarette pack tin. At 10:30 a.m., a guard named Slagle arrived at Pierpont's cell with his breakfast, but Harry complained he was ill. As Slagle turned to leave the cell, Pierpont jumped up, slapped the guard, drew his nut gun, and demanded his keys. Slagle refused, so Pierpont whacked him again and just took them. He used the keys to free Makeley, Russell Clark, and the 8 other prisoners. The trio, reunited again, busted up a wooden table and, using the guards as shields, headed for the steel door to break it open. On the other side of that door, guard J.T. Jones looked through the peephole and instantly knew what was happening. He grabbed a rifle, alerted the other guards, and called the local police. Guards armed with riot guns converged on the door while city police surrounded the prison. With 4 more steel doors beyond the guard room, Team Escapee was trapped. When the guards opened the steel door, Makeley pointed his gun at the officers and yelled at them to stand back. 2 guards opened fire. Makeley was hit 12 times, and Pierpont was hit 3 times, in the abdomen, back, and spine. 44-year-old Charles Makeley died in the prison hospital 10 minutes later. Pierpont was severely injured, but lived. Until October 17, 1934, when the electric chair finished the job on Handsome Harry. He was 32. J. Edgar Hoover's annoyance with Special Agent in Charge Melvin Purvis got so severe that he started looking for ways to remove him from office. That became even harder when Little Mel made another killing. On October 22, 1934, Purvis, 3 of his men, and 4 East Liverpool policemen led a raid on public enemy number 1, Pretty Boy Floyd. They cornered him on an Ohio farm near Clarkson, and as Floyd ran, they shot him. However, the actual sequence of events remained deliberately murky. G-men for the win, capiche? With John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd gone, Inspector Sam Cowley swore he'd take down Lester Gillis, aka Babyface Nelson, next. But this time, they'd rely on proper police work, not dumb luck. The new public enemy number 1 had fled to Nevada with his wife Helen, John Paul Chase, and Joe Fatso Negri. There was a massive fallout between Babyface and Chase's smart-ass girl Sally Bachman, and Nelson wanted to kill both her and Chase. After everyone intervened, Chase and Sally left the gang. They spent some time in New York City, but when Sally went home to San Francisco to settle her affairs, local police arrested her. She did the mole thing and said nothing until they told her that Chase wouldn't survive riding with Nelson. She could save him if she talked. Then she spilled all the beans. Using Sally as a tour guide, the feds found Nelson's Lake Geneva, Wisconsin hideout. When inn owner Hobart Hermanson told them that Babyface would return soon, they set up shop. Meanwhile, the feds raided all of Reno, forcing Nelson, Helen, and Negri to shack up at a tourist camp in Wally's Hot Springs, Nevada, with no electricity and no running water. When Nelson heard that the feds started raiding all the tourist camps, he got ready to leave. John Paul Chase returned to Reno and narrowly escaped a police trap at a local garage where he dropped off his car for repairs. With Sally gone, Chase rejoined Nelson and the gang. With money running low, everyone returned east for one more job, then retirement. Nelson, who finally managed to grow a mustache, hoped to team up with the Barker Karpis gang to execute the planned train robbery. He couldn't find them. In November, Nelson, Helen, and Chase drove a recently stolen black Ford V8 to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin to check in with Hobart Hermanson. Nelson didn't know Dillinger assassin Charles Winstead and 2 other G-men were camped out at Hermanson's home. However, the feds recognized Babyface too late and only got his license plate number, Illinois 639578. Sam Cowley in Chicago sent several agents north to find him, grabbed Ed Hollis, and headed out himself. Melvin Purvis, who was super busy polishing his shoes, offered to come along, but Cowley told him he had this. G-men William Bill Ryan and rookie Thomas McDade checked Lou Cernocchi's tavern in Fox River Grove, then headed north to Wisconsin. They noticed a black Ford heading south, and 578 on the license plate Nelson. Babyface saw their car making a U-turn and wondered what that was all about. He made a U-turn, and another, and came up behind them. He pulled up beside Ryan and McDade, yelling at them to pull over. Chase, in the back seat, pointed his Browning automatic at them. The federal men floored it. Nelson pushed Helen down and told Chase to shoot. Chase wasn't sure. They might be innocent men. Agent Ryan had no such doubts and fired at the Ford. Chase still hesitated, leaving Nelson to shoot at them with one hand on the wheel. When Chase finally fired, he hit nothing. The federal car pulled away, leaving Nelson's Ford eating its dust. One of Ryan's slugs had hit something under the V8's hood, and the car was losing power. The federal men pulled over, jumped out, and lay flat in the grass, ready for Nelson to drive by. Meanwhile, another federal car, a Hudson with Sam Cowley and Ed Hollis, made a U-turn and caught up with the slowing Ford. Nelson made a hard right into Barrington Park and slammed the brakes. Helen ducked for cover in a ditch. Nelson got on the running board, and Chase crouched by the hood, guns at the ready. The feds, who had overshot the park exit by 100 feet, stopped the Hudson at an angle and took cover behind their car. Neither agent wore a bulletproof vest because they were uncomfortable. Unleash the shootout! This jockey Cowley, who'd never even qualified at the Bureau's pistol range, struck Nelson with his Thompson 6 times just above his belt. A crazed Nelson grabbed a .351 automatic and, throwing caution to the wind, charged the Hudson. Cowley retreated to a ditch but was hit in his stomach and chest. Hollis struck Nelson's leg with his sawed-off shotgun, but Babyface kept coming. Hollis retreated behind a utility pole. His shotgun was shot and he drew his service pistol, but he was hit in the head and collapsed. Nelson backed the bullet-riddled Hudson toward the Ford, where he and Chase transferred their arsenal from the V8 to the federal car. Nelson, too wounded to drive, collapsed in the Hudson and told Chase to drive him and Helen to any safe house in the area. Babyface told his wife, "I'm done for." They ended up on Walnut Street in Wilmette. That evening, at 7:35 p.m., Lester Gillis died in bed, with his wife at his side. He was 25 years old. Agent Hollis was declared dead after arriving at the hospital. Agent Cowley lived long enough to tell Melvin Purvis that nothing would bring Nelson down. He died after surgery. Hoover ordered all Nelson hangouts to be raided. It yielded nothing. The following day, an anonymous phone tip led police to Nelson's body left in front of St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery in Skokie, Illinois. Chase had removed his clothing to delay identification, and Helen had covered his body with a blanket because he always hated being cold. When Helen read in the newspapers that J. Edgar Hoover had ordered, "Find the woman and give her no quarter," she surrendered on Thanksgiving Day. Helen was given the typical 12 to 18-month mole wrist slap for harboring her late husband and joined Billy Frechette in Milan, Michigan. Lester Gillis was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois. John Paul Chase was captured a little later. He was the first to be tried under the new federal law of killing a federal agent while in the performance of his duties, and was convicted of the murder of Agent Sam Cowley. Chase was sent to Alcatraz for life, but was paroled over Hoover's objections in 1966. He died in 1973. Hoover was enraged when he heard Melvin Purvis talk to the press about the incident and sidelined him completely. He replaced Sam Cowley with Special Agent in Charge Earl Connolly, who swore to take down the Barker Karpis gang next. Alvin Karpis was declared public enemy number 1. In the week of the Dillinger shooting, federal agents arrested James Probasco and his girl Peggy Doyle. Probasco was taken to the 19th floor of the Bankers Building for processing and interrogation. He leaped from a window to his demise. That was the official story. You see, G-Men had developed a nasty habit of dangling tight-lipped suspects by the heels from the office window. Some say they lost grip. They'd had a couple of close calls before. John Dillinger's lawyer, Lewis Pickett, his investigator, Arthur O'Leary, and Harold Cassidy, the doctor who had assisted Dr. Lozer in Johnny's cosmetic surgery, were all hunted down and arrested. O'Leary screamed that the federal goon squad broke 6 of his ribs during one of his interrogations. The feds got O'Leary and Cassidy to plead guilty, and they got suspended sentences. Pickett fought back and refused to plead guilty. He emotionally argued in court that he was just doing his job, protecting the rights of his client. He won the case. However, crafty prosecutors tried him again for harboring Homer Van Meter, who wasn't his client. This time, Pickett was convicted, disbarred, fined $10,000, and sent to Leavenworth Prison for 2 years. President Harry Truman pardoned him in 1951. Lewis Pickett died of a heart attack that same year in Chicago and was buried in Platteville, Wisconsin. In 1937, Ed Singleton, Dillinger's partner in the crime that got Johnny his first sentence, passed out drunk on a railroad track and was run over by a locomotive. Whitecapper William Shaw was released from prison in 1933 and died in a boarding house in 1977 when his mattress caught on fire. Harry Copeland was released from prison on November 24, 1949. On December 7, 1963, he was run over by a drunk driver and died, aged 67. Sam Goldstein is said to have ended his life in prison on the anniversary of John Dillinger's death, July 22, 1939. Ed Shouse died of a heart attack in Chicago on September 14, 1959, aged 54. The two remaining Michigan City escapees at large, John Burns and Joseph Fox, were both rearrested in 1934 and returned to prison. Both were eventually paroled. On March 2, 1935, Jack Perkins was arrested in San Francisco. He entered a guilty plea, got a 2-year prison sentence, and a fine of $1,000. Pat Riley was released from prison and died of pneumonia on March 23, 1963, aged 55. In 1968, Russell Clark was given a dying prisoner release. On December 24, 1968, he passed away from lung cancer. He was 70 years old. Arthur Doc Barker was arrested on January 8, 1935, and Russell Gibson was killed resisting the arrest. Evidence found during the arrest led the feds to a cottage near Lake Weir, Florida, where Fred Barker and his mother, Kate Ma Barker, were hiding. On January 16, 1935, during a 4-hour shootout, Fred and Ma Barker were killed. On February 6, Volney Davis was captured in St. Louis by federal agents, but he escaped when their plane was forced to land in Yorkville, Illinois. He knocked out a guard and stole a car. His girl Edna Rabbit Murray was arrested the day after in Kansas. She turned state's witness against the gang. On June 1st, Melvin Purvis recaptured Volney Davis. He was convicted of Bremer's kidnapping and sentenced to life imprisonment. Before being sent to Alcatraz, Davis turned state witness and gave information. He told the federal men where to find John Hamilton's badly decayed body near Aurora, Illinois. Red was identified through prison dental records. Public enemy number 1 Alvin Karpis pulled an armored car robbery and a train robbery in 1935, but was finally arrested in New Orleans on May 1, 1936. Hoover personally claimed credit for Karpis's arrest. G meant for the win and all, but the story is once again murky. In his book, The Alvin Karpis Story, Karpis told his own version. On July 27, 1936, Patricia Charrington was released. She toured in a Crime Does Not Pay show, but never lost her underworld ties. She died in a Chicago hotel on May 3, 1949, aged 45. Pat's sister Opal Long, Marie Conforti, Jean Delaney, and Helen Gillis were all paroled. Mary Kinder used her notoriety and perky personality to perform in Scout Younger's exhibit of outlawry, a traveling wax museum. She died after an illness in 1981, aged 72. Dillinger's girlfriend, Mary Longacre, got married and divorced 3 times. She died in October 1953. Beryl Hovius, Dillinger's only known wife, died in Mooresville of a stroke in 1993. She was 87. Polly Hamilton worked at Chicago's Ambassador East Hotel Room Service Department. She married William Black and died in Chicago from tongue cancer in 1969, aged 59. After Billy Frechette was released, she traveled the carnival circuit for a while, telling tales of her boo to enthralled audiences. She disappeared from the public when interest waned and got married twice. She died from oral cancer in Wisconsin, aged 62. Shortly before her death, she said, "I've had one hell of a life." John Dillinger Sr. eventually accepted invitations to lecture in stage shows and carnivals with Audrey and Hubert. He even appeared at the Little Bohemia Lodge where Emil Wanatka, who had divorced Nan, had established the Terror Gang Museum. John Sr. died in 1943, aged 79. He was buried beside his son. John's half-brother Hubert Dillinger became a mechanic for the once-hated Indiana State Police. He died on May 8, 1974, aged 60. John's sister, Audrey Hancock Dillinger, died in 1987 at 98 years old. John's half-sister Doris died on March 14, 2001, aged 83. Half-sister Frances died on January 13, 2015, aged 92. Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach remained furious at the FBI for sidelining him. He insisted an East Chicago cop, not a federal agent, had killed Dillinger. An annoyed J. Edgar Hoover got him fired as captain in 1937. Leach served as a major in the Army Air Corps during World War II and peddled a tell-all book on the Dillinger affair. But on his way home from a meeting with a New York publisher in 1955, he and his wife were killed in a car accident on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The manuscript was never found. Special agent in charge Melvin Purvis could never shake off the insanely jealous Hoover's wrath. Melvin resigned from the FBI in 1935 to write about his exploits and bank on his fame. His book, American Agent, was published in 1936. He hosted a children's radio show called Junior G-Men, was a judge advocate general colonel during World War II, and then went after Nazi war criminals for the War Crimes Office in Europe. Then Purvis got ill. He shot himself in 1960. His wife Roseanne believed he was murdered, but no evidence or motive was ever found. The ruthless J. Edgar Hoover continued to rule the Federal Bureau of Investigation with an ever-tightening iron fist until his death from heart failure in 1972. Cleverly using John Dillinger's reign, he'd build a crime-busting machine that outlasts him to this day, for better or worse. Nothing in history changed law enforcement in the United States of America more drastically than John Dillinger's 13-month reign of terror. First, there was the accelerated implementation of two-way radio systems in police cars, which would make car chases more effective and efficient. Dillinger's crime spree forced police departments to invest in better weapons, which were held in newly built bunker-like police stations. John made bulletproof vests the norm in law enforcement, and all policemen were given upgraded weapons training. Police departments improved their motor pools, adding fast cars with bulletproof glass, military tanks, and even aircraft. John's deadly reign introduced the deployment of the National Guard to fight domestic criminals and reinstated the Old West tradition of deputizing citizens to help erect roadblocks and protect jails. Firemen were deputized and armed. Escape artist Dillinger and many like him were also responsible for many prison reforms. Prisons got improved walls, added armored cages, and placed machine gunners in towers. Since Dillinger, banking was never the same. Banks installed higher railings and enclosed teller cages, bulletproof glass, and timer vaults. They got 24-hour security guards in security cages and deputized citizens to patrol the lot. Thanks to John, architects designed bank buildings with fewer windows, stronger walls, and a limited number of entrances and exits. Dillinger also altered the political landscape. From now on, governors no longer appointed inexperienced cronies as prison wardens and such. But most of all, Johnny shaped the Division or Bureau of Investigation, named the FBI in 1935, into what it is today. J. Edgar Hoover had Dillinger to thank for shutting down his political opponents who feared a federal Gestapo-like police force that undermined state rights. John's combined gangs had stolen some $300,000, and their capture had cost law enforcement agencies well over $2 million. 11 law enforcement officers and 6 citizens were killed in the crime spree, and many more were wounded. In the end, 11 Dillinger gang members were killed or executed, and 23 were sent to prison. At the time, he was by far the most famous felon, producing more newsprint and newsreel footage than Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, Pretty Boy Floyd, the Barker Karpus Gang, and Babyface Nelson. He wasn't a regional outlaw like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Al Capone, but the first truly national villain. The mythical John Dillinger was first invented by Captain Matt Leach and further dramatized by the press. But this fiction became reality when the man Dillinger embraced the persona, lived up to the myth, and after the Crown Point, St. Paul, and Little Bohemia Lodge escapes, exceeded it. After his demise, the government made sure there could never be another John Dillinger, the myth who became the man. But the mythical John Dillinger remains alive, long after his death, in books, in documentaries, and on his beloved silver screen.